Welcome aboard the Deep South's quintessential rail link to the Northeast, a one-seat ride from the Big Apple to the Big Easy. This is Amtrak's Crescent, a train so iconic it took 8 years for its old railway to give it to Amtrak, and so legendary that countless artists have sung about it or its route, from Johnny Cash to R.E.M. But in a day and age where you can fly between New York and New Orleans in just a couple hours for as low as $32, is it still worth taking the train? The only way to find out is to go for a ride. Let's take a look at the map. The Crescent begins in New York's Penn Station, then travels down the electrified Northeast Corridor to Washington, D.C., stopping in cities such as Philadelphia, where I'd be getting on. From here, it heads southwest into Virginia, through the Carolinas, into Georgia, and across Alabama and Mississippi, before crossing Lake Pontchartrain and ending up in New Orleans, Louisiana. Most of the right-of-way south of Washington is owned by Norfolk Southern, with a couple exceptions. More about that later. I began my journey in Philadelphia's 30th Street Station, opened by the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1933. Down on the platform, a Siemens ACS-64 locomotive led our train into the station, and I hopped on board. We slowly accelerated up to 110 miles per hour as we passed through Maryland and Delaware. Unfortunately, this proved to be a lot for the Amfleet 2 coaches, which shook back and forth at full throttle more than I've ever felt on the Northeast Regional or Keystone. This might have been due to the heavier baggage, sleeper, and dining cars in the consists. The window seat was also taken up, making it harder to film. Still, we were well on our way, on a journey that would take over 30 hours, if it was on time. The Crescent and its predecessor trains were originally operated by the Southern Railway. Even though the Southern never had tracks into the Northeast, they did have haulage agreements with the Pennsylvania Railroad, whose mighty GG1 electrics would haul Southern cars on the final track from Washington to New York. This haulage agreement carried over to Penn Central in 1968 and Amtrak in 1971. Wait, Amtrak? Yes, believe it or not, when Amtrak was formed in 1971, the Southern Railway decided not to relinquish the Crescent, and kept it running as a privatized overnight train. For a couple years, you could spot Southern locomotives hanging out with Amtrak F-40s in Washington, D.C.'s Ivy City Yard, and Southern would haul Amtrak sleepers down to New Orleans to transfer to the Sunset Limited. All that came to a close in 1978, when the Southern Railway decided their money-losing train was no longer worth it, and transferred full control to Amtrak. After Baltimore, we made a straight shot for Washington, D.C., where we had our first fresh air break in Union Station. This was the end of the Northeast Corridor electrification, so a pair of P-42 diesel locomotives arrived from Ivy City Yard to replace our ACS-64, and soon the locomotive transfer was underway. I also noticed the lead Amfleet had a swordfish on it for some reason. I'm sure someone in the comments can tell me why. Once the diesels were hooked up, we crawled south under Washington, passing directly underneath the U.S. Supreme Court, before emerging in the south of the district. Then we were on the Long Bridge across the Potomac, the third railroad bridge in this location and currently owned by CSX Transportation. The state of Virginia is currently eyeing the construction of a new parallel bridge for passenger trains, greatly expanding capacity on this bottlenecked route. We made a stop in Manassas, where I have fond memories of seeing trains pass during a family visit as a kid. DC marks the end of the Northeast megalopolis, the metro area spanning from Washington to Boston, and once we got out of the Northern Virginia suburbs, the scenery became much more lush, laid back, and rural, as the train topped out at a more leisurely 79 miles per hour. Finally getting the window seat was an extra bonus. This was once Southern Railway trackage, but just a year after surrendering the Crescent, the Southern merged with the nearby railroad Norfolk and Western to form Norfolk Southern. In 1982, operations were combined under the Norfolk Southern name and brand, and thus our train was now running on Norfolk Southern trackage. Historically, Amtrak hasn't had great relations with NS, even giving it the worst grade of its many host railroads, so I hoped our journey today wouldn't be too delayed by freight traffic. Night fell as we reached Lynchburg, home to Liberty University. It's here that the Northeast Regional splits off to Roanoke and the train enters the first Crescent-exclusive bit of the route, a section deeply rooted in railroad history. You see, in the early 1900s, the Southern had a lucrative contract to haul mail for the US government between Washington and New Orleans, but they were fined for every minute they were late. Like a grad student rushing to finish their thesis, the engineer of one of these trains was trying to make up for lost time in 1903 when he reached a trestle between Lynchburg and Danville. The excess speed caused the train to careen off a curve and plummet to the ground below, killing the engineer and several other people on board. Country music would remember this wreck through the ballad, The Wreck of the Old 97. Fun fact, this 1923 recording I found just entered the public domain this year, so I can use it without getting demonetized. Woo!
He was going down grade, making 9 miles an hour when his whistle bumped into a stream.
Crescent and its route have actually featured in other songs as well, perhaps most notably REM's 1985 song, Driver 8. Before we continue, be sure to check out my Patreon for early access to videos and bonus content. Right now, I've just posted my 17-hour Greyhound adventure that came right after the Crescent, taking me from New Orleans to Dallas. For as little as $1.80 per month, you can help keep Classy Whale videos coming out every week. It's definitely surreal to wake up in the middle of the night to a glittering skyline, but that's exactly what happened as we arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina. When I woke up again, we'd made it through South Carolina to Georgia, and we were now pulling into Atlanta's Peachtree Station. At one time, this tiny station served as a commuter terminal for the edge of downtown, a bit like Boston's Back Bay. But after Atlanta's terminal station closed in 1970, all southern services were moved here. Today, the Daily Crescent is the only intercity rail that the city gets. Back on the move, we crossed into Alabama and Central Time, one of the few places on the Amtrak network where trains cross time zones during the day. Tracks here pass through the Talladega National Forest, a 613 square mile preserve at the southern edge of the Appalachian Mountains. This was once extensively logged, leading to heavy environmental destruction, but since the federal government purchased it in the 1930s, it's now home to extensive pine forest regrowth. After crossing the Coosa River, where it looked like some Alabamans were having fun, the train deviated briefly onto CSX trackage and arrived in Birmingham. Looking back at this footage, this station reminded me a lot of Pittsburgh's Penn Station, with abandoned platforms and facilities. This was originally used by the Louisville and Nashville. The Southern Railway had its own station to the northeast. Between 1989 and 1995, a section of the Crescent would split off here and head south to Mobile under the name Gulf Breeze. Since my seatmate had left, I decided to film a quick seat tour. Amfleet 2 seats are really big and comfy, with more legroom than the Northeast Regional. I remember thinking I was in business class the first time I rode one. The recline is also generous, and there's a fold-out footrest, making it easier to sleep. After Tuscaloosa, we pulled onto a siding to wait for the northbound Crescent. Then we crossed into Mississippi, arriving in Meridian. It's here that a proposed set of cars would split off from the train and travel west to Fort Worth, Texas. This would involve the use of Kansas City Southern's Meridian Speedway from here to Shreveport, Louisiana, something KCS historically opposed. Thankfully, KCS is now part of the larger CPKC, which thus far seems friendlier to the idea. Also, what do you guys think of the new Mississippi flag? I personally am a huge fan. For the second golden hour of the trip, I was treated to some cozy views of Mississippi's small towns and forests. Then, at last, we were in Louisiana, leaving land and heading onto the 5.8-mile Norfolk Southern Lake Pontchartrain Bridge. This is the longest railroad bridge in the US, not to mention the longest rail bridge over water in the world. Since the bridge is single-tracked, it felt as if our train was floating above the lake. Lake Pontchartrain is an estuary off the Gulf of Mexico, covering 630 square miles, but often running only 12 to 14 feet deep, or about 2 calebs. This allows bridges to easily be built across it. So is it worth taking 30 hours to make this train trip when it could be done in much less time on a plane? Honestly, it depends on what you want to get out of it. It's a pleasant ride for sure, and one of the most scenic Amtrak routes to not feature much in the way of mountains. If you've done the California Zephyr and that sort of thing already, it might be a great choice for your next rail cruise. But I think the ultimate value of the Crescent is not its end destinations, but the places it links along the way. It gives smaller communities like Tuscaloosa direct rail access to the Northeast, New Orleans, and each other. So if you fit into either category of traveler, the Crescent is absolutely worth it. Jumping off in New Orleans, I bade farewell to our train and headed out through Union Station. From here, it was a quick walk to my hostel. The next day would be filled with adventures on New Orleans' streetcar system, but I already have a video out about that. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters for keeping my channel alive, and stay tuned for the next video.